I want to show you what these verses in Ephesians chapter 6 are all about. Let's remember where we've been in the book so far. In the last couple of sections, the Apostle Paul is addressing households. He writes to wives, and then he writes to husbands. And now in this section here, he addresses children and fathers. Let's take a closer look. In this section, really, Paul is addressing two things. He's addressing children right here in verses 1 to 3, and then he's addressing fathers. Children are to obey their parents. Let's take a look at this. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. The main command here comes in the very first part of verse 1. Children are to obey their parents in the Lord. Why are they to do that? Well, children are to obey because it's the right thing to do. And then, as if to solidify this point, to emphasize this point, Paul quotes one of the 10 commandments. He quotes the 5th commandment. Let's take a look at each phrase here. Children. Paul addresses children. He's addressed wives, then husbands, now children, then fathers. Children. Who is really Paul addressing here? Because technically everyone is somebody's child, right? So is Paul addressing every human? No, he's actually not addressing every human. He's addressing those who are young, those who are still in the home, those who are still dependent on their parents. They're not old enough to live on their own. That's who Paul is addressing here. And that matters, I think, because sometimes parents forget this. Sometimes parents, especially of those who are young adults, but yet adults, sometimes parents forget that those who have moved out of the home, those who aren't under their roof anymore, aren't under their authority anymore. But children, those who are still in the home, children are to obey their parents. That is a difficult thing to do. It takes humility for a child to obey their parents. But I think the beautiful thing about this text is that one way to look at this is that when every member of the family tunes themselves to Jesus, that's what makes a healthy family. And so wives submit to their husbands. You know, Jesus himself submitted to the Father. And so wives can imitate Christ in that. Husbands are to love their wives and sacrifice for their wives, just like Jesus sacrificed for the church. And children, as they obey their parents, they can imitate Christ in that as well, because Jesus submitted and obeyed not just his heavenly Father, but also Mary and Joseph. So Jesus set the example for children. So children should understand this. There's no place for thinking, well, I'm kind of above this. I don't need to be obeying my parents. No, Jesus even did that. There's an amazing account of this when Jesus and Mary and Joseph, they go to Jerusalem. Do you remember this? And Mary and Joseph travel back, but Jesus stays behind. And Mary and Joseph have lost Jesus. They return, finally find him in the temple. But after Jesus is found by them, Luke 2:51 says this, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued to be subject to them. So even Jesus obeyed his parents. And, Mary and Joseph were not perfect parents. One example is losing Jesus on the way back to their hometown. And so they're not perfect parents. And yet Jesus submits to them. And so children, I think, can look to that example. This is the right thing to do. This is right. It's right for children to obey their parents. Then Paul quotes the Old Testament here. The Old Testament, the 10 Commandments. Here I've bolded it. Honor your father and mother. And then there's this parentheses. This is Paul's comment on the 5th commandment. Honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. So it's kind of like there's two reasons Paul's giving for why children should obey their parents. Number one, it's the right thing to do. But number two, God blesses a child who will honor and obey their parents. Show me a child who honors and obeys their parents, and I will show you a child who will succeed in life. But on the other side, show me a child who disregards their parents and disobeys and disrespects them. And I'll show you a child who's really going to struggle to hold down a job in life. Let's talk about this word honor. Honor your father and your mother. Not just your father, but also your mother. Honor, it's not, just live your life and no matter what you do, don't bring dishonor upon them. It's not just a negative command, it's a positive command here. It's do things that honor them. Do things that hold them in high regard. This is right for a child to do. What do you do, though, if your father or your mother is not a good person? And they have done all kinds of things to lose your respect. Must you still honor them? Well, this isn't saying that a child should turn a blind eye to the faults of their parents, or even that they must always agree with their parents. I think a child can disagree with their parents, but they are to honor their parents. If they disagree, they're to do so in a way that is respectful and honoring. And even a child who has a parent who has not been a good parent should still remember that God gave them that parent, that father, that mother. God gave them that father and mother, and their parents gave them life. And so even if it's just for that reason, you show them honor. This is the first commandment with the promise. I think God makes things go well for the child that honors their parent. There's a supernatural blessing that God gives to children who honor their parents. Okay, that's to children. Now, Paul addresses fathers. It's interesting that he doesn't address fathers and mothers here. I kind of would have expected that, but instead he focuses in on fathers. And he gives really kind of don't do this, but do that. So don't do this, but do this. Do not provoke your children to anger. Fathers really can do this. How do you provoke a child to anger? You can provoke a child to anger by having unrealistic expectations for them. You can provoke a child to anger when you refuse to apologize as a dad. If you never admit fault and it's always somebody else's fault, that's provoking your children to anger. That's just stirring up bitterness in them. Dads, don't do that. You will regret that. Instead, so don't do that, but bring them up. Raise them up. And this is so important. There is no place in the Christian life for a father to say, oh, raising the kids, that's the mom's job. No, Paul looks at fathers in the eye and he says, bring them up. Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. There's discipline that goes into raising children, but don't just dole out consequences. Instead, if a child steals or lies or does something wrong, don't just dole out consequences, but your consequences are to point them to the Lord. It's a way of instructing your child in the ways of the Lord. And so discipline and instruction of the Lord. Dads, it's on you to instruct your children in the ways of the Lord. That responsibility is placed on you. And here's the thing. When the parent-child relationship looks like this, that makes for a beautiful home. When the children honor their parents and respect and obey their parents, and then the fathers don't provoke the children to anger, but instead point them to Christ, that is God's recipe for a peaceful home. All right, thank you guys so much for joining us. We will see you again next time.